Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of the Artist Statement podcast. My name's Madeline, and I'm here today with our lovely guest, AK Kurtz. Welcome, welcome.
Hello.
Hey. So, AK, can you start off by introducing yourself a little bit and telling us about who you are and what you make?
Sure. I'm AK. I am originally from Michigan, but I live in Pittsburgh now. I've been here for about 10 years. I primarily make, I guess you could say, like two-dimensional art. I do a lot of printmaking, painting, digital drawing, and some paper sculpture, origami, things like that. I'm dabbling in a little bit of glass art right now, but I'm definitely still a novice. A lot of my work revolves around pigeons and self-portraiture through pigeons. I love to do anything with repetition. I love the idea of like stamps or using the same image to either create a sense of chaos or um, a sense of depth without doing a whole lot of setting or background. I don't tend to have a lot of that in my work. It's usually just an image. Um, yeah, I guess that's that for
Yeah, great intro.
now.
What initially drew you to making art?
Yeah, I'm the kind of person. I did a lot of art as a kid, as I think honestly kids naturally do. I drew a lot. I do come from a family where art was very important. My dad mostly through photography. My grandmother was a docent at the Detroit Institute of Art, and I actually have a great video of her and my grandfather in the late 1970s did a promotional commercial for the museum, and it's
Oh,
really
no
cute.
way.
Um, so
That's
I
awesome.
yeah, I was definitely encouraged to that. My favorite uncle, my uncle Ken, when he would come to town from Miami, we would sit and draw for hours, and he would draw these fantastical creatures. He was a set design theater person, so there's just lots of like kind of organic art making. My grandma's sister, I have a couple of her paintings. But I also like when I was a young kid, I did art, and then I think the last like formal training I consider having had was in seventh grade. Um, and I got like a B minus on something. I actually have that artwork. It's an egg floating in a sky, but I have it on my kitchen in my kitchen displayed because I love it. And but something about that, I was like, oh, I guess I must not be good at this, and I stopped pursuing it. Um, so it's just kind of an interesting like experience of thinking you're not good at something. And then I got back into art. I did major in film history with a little bit of production in college. So I was able to do a little bit of expression or creative expression. And I do love editing and cinematography and kind of all of the visual aspects that go into film. Um, but I didn't really get back into sort of two-dimensional exploration until I was like 22 or 23.
Oh, wow.
And primarily unless like my public school definitely had good arts education, and all of those like elders in my life definitely practicing and playing with drawing was formative, but I do consider myself mostly self-taught in that I haven't really I haven't done any like other than like pure technical skills of like this is how you create a screen. I haven't done any classes in printmaking or any of the other mediums that I find most interesting.
It's really impressive, and I would not have ever guessed that just based off of looking at your artwork. It seems like you have a really solid technical base, so that is
Thanks.
surprising to hear.
Yeah.
I guess that kind of leads into my next question, which is what does your current practice look like, and how did you kind of get to having that current practice?
Yeah. It does ebb and flow. I am a very routine based kind of person. So I have benefited in the last maybe like I'd say like broadly in the last decade. So I'm 40 now. Since my early 30s, I've been developing a daily drawing practice. I was working as a waitress, and I started volunteering at Carnegie Museum of Art as a volunteer for summer camp, and I thought I like fell in love with that. That was amazing. And as like I know you know, but um, as I got into Carnegie Museum, I ended up meeting people and becoming a part-time senior teaching artist, and that actually helped develop my practice even more so. And in a way, it was a little bit of imposter syndrome, of fear of being found out. It's like, oh, I'm not really an artist. I need to actually do art to be doing this. But also just working with kids. And I mean, as foundationally from my family and growing up going to museums and having a lot of both appreciation for, and it's funny, I'm like sitting here in my living room and I'm looking at a painting that my uncle did and a painting of my grandfather that were in my grandparents' home, and it's just kind of cool. And then a print that I bought at the art fair in Ann Arbor, where I grew up with my dad. I have a print, actually, let's see, a painting I drew and a print behind me. But anyway.
Surrounded, literally.
Surrounded by family history art. Anyway, I got off track. So my practice is informed by kind of the fire got lit under me by working a lot with kids and kind of just playing with materiality. Like, art is definitely playtime for me. I definitely tend to be a much more neurotic person in the rest of my life. And so somehow I gave myself permission to let art just be whatever it is. And like, it is the state of just doing. So if I sit down and I scribble on a receipt, that's art that I made that day. That got honed more with, I did a lot of these 100-day projects, primarily through Instagram. There is literally an Instagram that's like, do the 100-day project. And I followed that for a while. It can be formless, themeless. You can stick to something. It's very self-directed, which I appreciate. I tend to struggle with things like very prompted, like Inktober, where I'm like, I don't want to draw, like, or like I get really nervous about drawing something right. And it's like, okay, this is not what I want. But the ways that I've had success with a 100-day project and doing something every day is sticking to it. Like, what I did 100 days with faces, and I loved that because it was basically just my own face, and I just drew self-portraits every day. Sometimes I've had like just one pen that I use, like sticking with the material as the consistent thing, but I can draw whatever. It's mostly been drawing. I did try to do 100 days of film projects, and that was like very unstable. I was not able. I did like one or two, and then I was like, oh, this takes a lot of work. I can't do this every day.
I can't even imagine with that.
Yeah. It's funny. Like, I was talking with a friend about my perception of time. Like, if I'm doing something, I have to be constantly looking at a clock to be aware of the passage of time. And I don't know, but like, if I look at the bus schedule and I'm like, bus will be here in 18 minutes, I never think to find out what time it is right now and when 18 minutes from now is. I just am like, 18 minutes, that's an amount of time. So similar with art making, I will just like sit down and do the art making, and 4 hours might pass. So when you have a more highly technical skill that requires a lot of steps, like filmmaking, it's like, oh, this is not actually feasible in a day.
Right.
Or at least to produce a finished work, and you could modify how you approach it. So that's been really helpful just in terms of having a daily practice. It's really natural and normal to me now. Like, I've created this pocket, and granted, it is often while I'm like watching TV and just sort of like lounging at the end of the day. But having the expressive outlet of Instagram also, like, it's not, I don't produce content as it were, but I am somewhat externally motivated by having like this illusion in my head that I'm like, oh, I gotta get this out, because if I don't, it's like I'm not producing this thing for my quote unquote audience. I don't really think that, but yeah, that really helps a lot, kind of with my daily practice. And it could be like, I consider anything from making an origami sculpture to doing a quick texture rubbing of something to like a longer form drawing, that I don't really get to those as often, but yeah.
Very fair. So you've mentioned a lot of mediums that you enjoy working in. Are there any that you like have tried and now you will not go anywhere near?
Oh, that's
like
a great
least
question.
favorites?
So I would love charcoal, but I cannot handle the texture.
Oh my God.
I hate it so much. Like the way it sounds and feels on the paper.
Right.
Anything that is like more like texturally significant. I have a hard time with clay and ceramics, unfortunately. Like, I would love to push myself and have more of a three-dimensional understanding, which I've been trying to do with glass a little bit. But clay, when it gets dry in your hands, there's just like so much like tactile information that I struggle. I think that's why paper for me like feels much safer, I guess. I don't know. It's much less hand washing, I guess, unless you're printmaking, then you're really messy. But yeah, I would say those are the two mediums that I'm like probably not gonna go back to.
That is so funny. Those are also my two least favorite mediums. Like, I will not touch them anymore. So
Whoa,
I
yeah.
feel very seen right
Yeah.
now. Yes.
We have solidarity.
Us
Yes.
against the world, us against the
Yes.
charcoal drawers and the
Oh no, you froze
ceramicists.
again.
Awesome. So you mentioned briefly your time as a teacher, and you still teach, correct? Oh,
I don't teach as much anymore. Also, it froze a
okay.
moment ago, but I don't know if I missed anything. We were talking about Clay, and then you asked about the teacher. I don't teach as much. I stopped teaching at the museum in early 2020, partly being furloughed for the pandemic. But I got a job at the Pittsburgh Glass Center at the front desk, and I now work as the registrar. And that was like a physical decision where I have a mobility issue, so I decided that working in jobs where I needed to walk around the museum and carry supplies were probably not going to be like a longevity thing in my future. Um,
Right.
I do like, I have the capacity and I have interest in doing like one off workshops on occasion. Um, and I definitely enjoy, I mean, I'm the kind of person who I learn from explaining like verbal processing and that kind of thing. So like I love to talk about my medium or mediums of choice, but I don't do as much like formal teaching anymore.
Fair. Um, to kind of go off of what you mentioned that you are a person who uses a walking aid, and that imagery is present in some of your artworks. I want to know a little bit more about what motivates you to include that imagery and what impact does its inclusion have on your artwork, in your
Yeah,
opinion?
definitely. And like, I guess, I don't know, sidebar, I have a long written list because there were like several questions on the original list that go to this.
Yeah.
Um, I think so. There's a lot of things. There partly it's a bit of like realism, where I simply use a cane, and that's just like going to be part of my self portrait, just as much as glasses or hairstyle or something would be for someone. Um, there's also a couple like two or three different points that I'll try to get to. Uh, One is I love saint based iconography. I'm not particularly religious myself, but I am really drawn to that sort of you can tell who the saint is and what what they're the patron of because of the tools that they're holding in their hands. I love that kind of symbolism and looking at the use of tools to convey meaning, whether it's in the Bouguereau portrait at CMOA that all of us instructors have probably used and thinking, oh, well, the handle of that rake is not dirty, so they're probably not using it. It's probably a prop at a studio, like those kinds of ideas. So I love how including tools in artwork can give you a lot of information and meaning. A number of my pigeon portraits have the pigeon person either. There's one that I love that they're holding a seam ripper, but it's the size of if the size of a seam ripper as though a pigeon itself were holding it, and so it's like really big, and it becomes almost like weapon-like or sort of a defense mechanism, if you will. A pigeon person holding a fork, because I was like, well, how would the pigeon person eat? And so using the mobility aids as part of that, it's like that for me. It's simply a tool to make sure I get out and move around. I also love thinking about it. I don't do as much sculptural work, but I love thinking about a third point of contact, like you might have with like terpsichore leaning on a pedestal, or like having a god or deity of sorts having some kind of tree stump or something that they're leaning against. I actually used that phrase with my like one of my doctors. I said it's just the third point of contact. He's like, so you understand physics? And I was like, I guess, like, not really, but we'll go with that. So it has a sort of an art history background to it. I think there's also like the other kinds of connections here. It's like it has a lot to do with a lot of my work explores gender as well as disability, and so there's and like I don't know, body size also goes into that for me. So it's like I'm a tall person. I'm 5'10". I wear size 12 and a half shoes, and even just something as simple as trying to find like orthotic shoe inserts by Dr. Scholl's, I have to buy like men's. And being non-binary, it's interesting because it's like I just have feet that are on my body. They're not gendered, but now I have to think about gender when I'm buying this thing for the body that is my size. So it's very interesting experience, and that's like one of the lighter sides. Um, Being a fat person, I will incorporate the actual size and shape and like I don't know fluff of my own body into my artwork, because I think that's important. It's important to me as like, this is a simple fact. Um, I use a lot of, there's not necessarily a lot of nudity in my work, but like sometimes I play with the idea. It's like, would a pigeon person wear clothes? I don't know. How would they wear them? Um, is the feathers, are the feathers like a garment? Who knows? But so like thinking about that sort of like, I wouldn't want to draw myself in any way other than that which I am, except for I guess a half pigeon, which is not real, but you know. Um, so it's like, it's kind of like thinking about like I'm asexual, and I think like nudity doesn't always have to be sexualized, and I think we talk about that a lot as art instructors in the museum, and looking at like the human body and thinking about how it's like interesting and natural and difficult to draw or sculpt. And so there's this conversation a lot of the times about nudity versus I don't know, sexualized objects. But all of that kind of comes together. It like, I think also like a lot of my drawing, I haven't done this kind of drawing in a while, but a lot of my drawing in like the mid, like I don't know, 2015, 2016 was like coming to terms with having a chronic pain issue. And I would draw the experience I had internally. So I would like maybe draw my body shape, and then I would draw like colors and like, you know, lines around it or something to indicate what I was physically experiencing. Or I also think a lot about how posture and gesture can often convey a it like a social experience that I may not be intending, but if I'm like shifting around and like leaning, I'm not bored. I'm just, my skeleton's just trying to readjust itself. So like it's interesting to be inside of a body that's going to physically convey something. Or if I say I need to have a seat, it's not because I'm settling in for a long conversation. It's because it's hard for me to stand for more than like 5 minutes. But that conveys something to the person that you're engaging with, and it's like a certain kind of vulnerability. Like, so I like to involve that in my work as much as I can, just that kind of imagery.
Definitely. That was an excellent answer, and I feel like it answered a lot of the questions that I had about your themes in your work.
I can send you the paragraphs that I wrote.
Let me see. So you talked a little bit about some mythological references that you enjoy including in your art, and your art historical references as well. What is the thought behind that, and how has like Greek or Roman mythology inspired you? Like, do you have a backstory to that?
Yeah, I think, well, I love obviously like the idea of a kind of a centaur chimera sort of beast, Therian type thing. I'm trying to think. I think at first I used pigeons because they were. I just love pigeons. I actually, sorry, I'm like stumbling over my brain.
You're fine.
Birds and pigeon type, or birds and bird-like mythology. Like there's a lot of sirens, or why can't I think of the word for the other one that is a bird? Harpy. That's right. I had somebody came I had a show at Pulp Proof in like September of 2022, and someone came in to see it, and they said, "Oh, harpies." And I was like, "Oh my God, I didn't really think about that." And then someone else that same day said, "Oh my gosh, they're angels," because it's like me essentially with like wings flying in the air. And I was like, "Oh my God, I didn't think about that." It's just literally, to me, it's just me as a pigeon. And I was like, that's really funny. So there's sort of an interplay of that, like, oh yeah, that is what I did, isn't it? When it becomes mythological after the fact. I was basically just playing around with, I had a calendar that had a pigeon on it, and I was like, oh, I wonder what that would look like if I became that pigeon. And then it just went from there. I do have a lot of interest in sort of like, I think my interest in mythology comes from feeling a little bit like an alien, going through a long time in my young adulthood, not really knowing what, like, I don't know. I was diagnosed autistic a couple of years ago, and I not having that diagnosis, and also having some people, like therapist or so people saying, "Oh, you couldn't possibly be autistic because you're so chatty." I was like, "Well, I guess I'm not that. I must be something else." And I kind of got into that like star seed, like more like mystical spirituality kind of thing for a little while. I have moved on from that because I didn't. I don't know. It served its purpose, but it was like, okay, well, I'm clearly like some kind of alien. That must be the answer. Is like what I went
Right.
to, because medical science wasn't willing to adjust itself for a little while. Feeling like at odds or like not understanding people or not really understanding why things were happening or like having some communication struggles really led to that. So I think that's like where I got then interested in mythology. I love fairy tales and myths and any kind of story that has like a repetitive like structure or theme to it. Something that's more about like the growth of what happens to a character. There's certainly are a lot of myths that are very like plot based, but I tend to gravitate towards the more like moralistic ones that are like kind of like lessons on how to behave. Um, I think that that just really appeals to me, and I don't know. I guess that's where that comes from.
Yeah. Something that you mentioned there about feeling like an alien kind of relates to a question I had about your earlier work. When I was researching you and going way back into the AK archives on Instagram, I noticed that a lot of your, I don't want to say earlier work, but work from a while ago had themes of like a person on a planet in outer space. Could you speak a little bit more about that? Because I also noticed that that was a motif that ended pretty abruptly from the looks of it.
Yeah, that definitely relates to not knowing I was autistic and feeling like I was separate from the group, but while being amongst it. A lot of that sort of I'm an island of myself, like very disconnected from everyone and to an extent. Constantly striving for connection and often like missing the mark in a lot of places. Um, and not knowing why or what was going on. So like that's definitely related. I do think that that imagery sort of fell off, like not intentionally necessarily, but like once I got diagnosed, I was like, oh, this is what's going on, and it was like it was so helpful because I was like, oh, I could like reframe and understand what was happening and like I don't know, monitor my sensory intake and sort of if like approaching things that way, I have so much more grounding in like ways to connect with people, kind of like giving myself grace, but also in a way like understanding why something I did might be off-putting to somebody else, and not necessarily with the knee-jerk reaction of like adjusting that, but just being like, oh, they might not have liked that, noted, and you know, figuring it out. So I think that like I've genuinely like developed some really good friendships in the last couple years, based on just like it's that more like self-awareness, and that's helped to not feel so lonely, which kind of makes sense. And I think also there's like a lot of that earlier work was definitely like a gender exploration in a sense that I let's see if I can tell the story quickly. um
Take your
for
time.
yeah I grew up in like the 80s and 90s when there wasn't as much language around being non-binary. There I had an awareness of trans people, but I didn't that isn't something that I related to at the time, and I don't still don't really consider myself trans exactly. um and I knew some non-binary people in like the early 2000s and like online, but it very much seemed to be a thing where you had to be like straight up androgynous in order to be non-binary. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I was like, oh, like some like literally I learned everything from Instagram, and it was like, oh, you non-binary people do not owe anyone androgyny. And I was like, oh, that's amazing.
Absolutely.
And it's like I can still be like, you know, uh, I can still do feminine things and I don't have to reject them. And I can do masculine things, but I don't necessarily like have to be fully masculine in all ways to be considered non-binary. Like just because I'm assigned female at birth, like that sort of thing. So a lot of that art was kind of this like there's a lot of very femininity oriented things in that. It's a lot of like me as a figure standing wearing a dress and sort of like doing like yoga poses or things like not that yoga is necessarily feminine, but there was a lot of that energy there. And I think that once I like recognized like, oh, I'm not like allowed to be non-binary, but like I definitely just straight up am. Okay. Uh, moving forward, it all kind of clicked for me around the same time. And I was like, cool. Like I don't feel as compelled to, maybe it's like also like feeling kind of unseen as like I appear and my voice sounds and I don't know if I act feminine necessarily. I probably act medium in lots of ways. But like I do wear dresses and that's actually because of my disability. It's my like lower back is painful, so I don't like to wear pants. But it's just a silly kind of a thing. So I know that I present as more female, but I am now okay with being seen as that, even if it doesn't necessarily match what I feel like inside. Because it's like it's not that it doesn't matter. Gender matters to me, but it's like I'm much more confident in myself and my way of being perceived, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. It was like a very good explanation of that experience and someone coming to terms with that. Um,
Coming to terms with that by becoming a pigeon.
right. We got to do what we got to do,
Yeah,
honestly.
coping strategies, honestly.
um, so you mentioned briefly, again, a little bit back in the conversation about how you were starting to develop more friendships after your autism diagnosis. And we share a friend, and that's how we kind of connected, the
Yeah.
lovely Abby Michalowski. And you two recently had a show at Pull Proof titled Burnout and Respite. Could you talk a little bit about the process that you went through to create the show and your experience with artistic burnout?
Yeah, definitely. I think the show came out of probably every third day or so. Abby and I would text the other person like, "Oh, we should do the show about this," just in like the general course of friendship. So we've had a lot of ideas. One of Abby's favorite things is to say that she had to forcibly scale back a lot of my ideas because I'm often shared documents and just will write, and she's like, "That's not going to work," and has to be like the manager of the situation. We both experienced kind of going through the like very real um, experience of being furloughed from the museum as teaching artists and being museum employees where a lot of before the unionization effort there, and maybe even still, there was often a lot of idea that it's like, yeah, we're not going to compensate you with money, but you get to be around art all the time. And this sort of notion that like this job is really great because you're looking at art in the museum. And that can lead to burnout when it's like you are really enthusiastic and excited and you want to do that job and you're creative and you have a lot of great ideas and you really bond and connect with the students you're teaching and your fellow teaching artists and everyone. And you're kind of driving and pushing yourself because you're working in this role that is like gig based and not necessarily much structure or system for it, especially pre-unionization. I would constantly have to say yes to programs. I am the kind of person who is just like go until I literally am like forced to stop. But momentum is what keeps it going, and then momentum is not sustainable. I think a lot of artists probably experience that. I would guess a lot of like uh, production based artists especially, but really any of us who are like, well, that's really fun and we're really stimulated and excited by the world, and then also like can feel things very strongly. It just tends to burn out a lot. I think Abby might have had a different experience, which she can speak to her own. But for me, for burnout, it was just like actually like less art related, and more so I was working a public facing job during the pandemic and got to a point where like I was a front desk person and I was having to check people's vaccine cards, and it was to do activities, and there were oddly enough not a lot of people that were angry, just people who didn't realize they had to bring it and were disappointed, and I was having to feel disappointment about like people not being able to do art activities. And I counted and there were like over like 1,200 people in like 2 or 3 months that I had to check and have this conversation with. And I was like, this is actually too taxing. I cannot do this anymore. And I had to like take 6 weeks off from work because like the place I work is great. They were able to give me that time and have been supportive ever since. And they were supportive during that time. But I don't think anybody knew how to be supportive during the pandemic.
Right.
So my experience of burnout was just kind of like reaching a point where I was no longer able to kind of like cover. I don't know if that's like mask is the word that's used, but it's funny in the pandemic, it's a different word. Like I was no longer able to kind of play the customer service person that I have
Mm-hmm.
been able to do. That role wasn't like accessible to me. And I was like really ground down to like my like inner core bits and very raw. And that's also like it's impossible, I think. Well, maybe some artists, but for me, it's impossible to then create when there's no callus over the wounds, if you will. I don't have that energy. Like, I couldn't even make myself food, let alone like create art. So I
Mm.
think it's like not having your resources internally. And then the show morphed over time, but it kind of became about like, how do you support your friends when you're both burnt out? How are you there for somebody when it's just too much? You can't really do the transactional thing of, well, you were there for me, so I'll be there for you. Any of that is very difficult. And we talked a lot about like, how can, like, people will say like, oh, art is so therapeutic, and I don't think either Abby or I believe that. It's not, it was like, it's not therapeutic like, going to the spa, I guess.
Right.
It's more, maybe it can a little bit be like, oh, I'm so angry, I need to do this thing, or like scribbling or something. Like, there can certainly be a part of that, but it's not like, there sometimes it's like, okay, I need to like, I really want to do this kitchen lithography thing. Okay, now I need to buy, Coca-Cola and vegetable oil, and and then it just doesn't work when you try to do it, and it's frustrating, and it's like not fulfilling like you'd like it to be. And that can be even harder when you're then burning out and you don't have that access to, like, whether financial, physical, or um, internal resources. But what we both found also, like for me, as I mentioned before, like I tend to really respond well to routine. And something that brought me out of that specific burnout that I had experienced in, I guess that was like December 2021 into early 2022, I did a fun a day project. And it was just literally like taking a color stick and finding textures of things in my home, like my white noise machine, and doing it, or like the coffee French press container, and like turning those in, or like I have these like textured coasters, turning that into a digital art print. So it was something that it's like, it was very easy, accessible in my home, and low stakes, and not messy
Mm.
most of the time. Um, and so I could like, that was something that like helped bring me out of it. And then I tend to turn to that if I'm feeling that's in myself again. Like, I don't really know what the signals are, but like I have the resources I need to like establish a low grade routine. So yeah.
Awesome. More of a general question, moving into the um, the latter part of our interview.
Yes.
Who would you say your favorite artists are?
Ooh, yes. Um, I love Kay Sage. She is kind of like tangentially related to the surrealists. She does a lot of work with architecture and sort of dystopic landscapes. Her husband was Yves Tanguay, and he does a lot of things with these sort of like blobby figures in like a long landscape, kind of similar in some ways, I think, to Salvador Dali's sort of like, you can see things on the horizon, or Rene Magritte has that as well. Um, but Kay Sage, I just love her. Like, she uses a lot of like gray and just these like atmospheric landscape with like strong architectural floating structures. So very dreamscape, but not in a dreamscape way that like, not like Salvador Dali with like melting clocks, but just like it's a time and a space that may not exist. So she's probably one of my favorites. I used to live in Chicago, and I would always go to a particular gallery, the Surrealism Gallery at the Art Institute. So really anyone whose work is in there. The Joseph Cornell boxes are a huge favorite of mine. The like shadow box like sculptures, and Max Ernst as well. I also kind of unexpectedly, Frederick Edwin Church is one of my favorite artists,
Okay.
from the 19th century Hudson River School. Um, he did so at
Great.
at the Carnegie Museum. He did the iceberg painting. That's like what I really love about his work is he traveled in like the 1840s to 60s to places like the Arctic and South America and did these like incredible hyper realistic landscapes in a time like mid like photography advent was coming around, and so there it did exist, but it was not as widespread, especially color photography, of course. And it like I just his work is just so astonishing. I went to the Met in New York 5 or 6 years ago, probably more than that now, maybe 10 years ago, and I saw one of like a large scale painting of his from South America, and I just like cried, and I was like kind of shocked because I was like, wow, like, huh. But I was like like misting up and just like sobbing, and it was just like sort of astonishing. So I don't know, I just love that, and I love like kind of unexpected landscapes, like not farmlands or mountains, but icebergs. Like that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's
That's
the
the best feeling,
yeah
like crying when you see a piece that is like unmatched, truly.
yeah yeah it really is.
So what would you say you are most excited about for your future art making, art practices, or events that are coming up?
Ooh, okay. Let's see. I don't actually have any events on the horizon. I was lucky enough to have a show in January, February, March, and April this year.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, yeah. I was like, whoa. I was like, what if I keep it up? And then I just like, it's not like I lost steam, but I was like, that's fine.
Yeah.
I'll find another show. There are, but in terms of mediums, I am really getting into flame working in the glass world. Um, since I work at the
Oof.
Pittsburgh Glass Center, I tried hot glass, and that's obviously it's very physical, a lot of moving around. One of my friends is the hot shop coordinator, and she was like, she's very practical, and she was like, okay, I was helping out, being like a person to help the instructors to learn how to teach, and she's like, okay, can you walk from here to there with both hands on this? And I was like, I cannot. And she's like, okay, we'll figure this out together. And it was like, can you lift your hand, like, very like much of the technical stuff. And I was like, I cannot do that. So I'm like, okay, hot shop is kind of out unless I had like a partner doing it with me.
Hmm.
I tried doing work in the kiln shop, which is like working with glass while it's cold and putting it together to be fused, or mosaics or stained glass. And I liked that. I really, really love casting, but it's very physically taxing. It's like a lot of grip strength and a lot of like you're like cutting glass, like kind of obviously, and like dealing with like sharpened. So like my manual dexterity is not so great. I can do origami, but anything that requires like, I don't know, force or strength is hard.
Hmm.
And then you have to like carry your projects to the kiln with both hands, and it was like I would just overextend myself. But I stayed away from the flame shop thinking it would be like really strenuous, and it actually is not. I got to take an 8-week class in marble making um, over the past couple of months, and it was amazing. And like you're basically sitting in front of the flame, so you can stay seated the entire time. You're just kind of like adjusting and like holding the glass in the flame, but it's not too heavy, and it's so you're sort of rotating, and I could definitely do that. And then you can also, there's a tiny kiln next to you, so you could like put your work down and get up and get water and like kind of take a break for a bit and then come back to it. Whereas like a lot of other mediums, you can't necessarily stop once you've started.
Mm.
And there's not too much cleanup. I mean, it's like you're working with glass rods and you just have to sweep your station. And so like I'm so excited to have found that, because it's like the material is endlessly engaging, and I'm super novice, but I'm really, really excited to keep working with it.
Awesome. I'm so excited to see the results.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I think my final question for you for today would be, what do you want people to know that they wouldn't be able to just by looking at your art?
Ooh, let's see. Maybe so kind of this similar to what I was just saying, like it is actually important for people to know that I do struggle with manual dexterity.
Hmm.
So like instead of like I love lino cutting and wood cutting, but that's harder, so I do screen printing, because I can draw digitally, produce the image, and then like I can pull the ink on the print. Um, it is somewhat physically taxing, but since I have a membership at Pullproof, I'm able to kind of go in and work at my own pace. Um, I just, like it's sort of interesting to think about like how much of art is manual and like repetitive, and obviously like practicing your craft over and over again. I do have to take a lot of breaks. A friend of mine was asking me, she like when I said, oh, I have another show coming up in April, like just a couple works, and she was like, "How do you have all this time for these shows?" I'm like, "Well, printmaking is great because it's you can make multiple iterations of something,
Right.
and then I have 10 works that I made, and that, But also, I was like, well, I made the base for this one in like 2021, and then I just printed something on top of it. So here's like, it sort of is like an ever evolving thing that doesn't take me. I'm not making all that work like this week for next month, like. Um,
Right.
so it was an interesting question though, because I was like, yeah, I don't really consider myself to be like someone who has abundant time to do process, except like, and my daily work is like a small drawing or something. Abby often chastises me, she's like, you should just work on one drawing for a week and like take it to its height, in her Abby way. um
Right.
but uh yeah, I guess that's what I would want people to know about me that they can't really see in my art. Maybe I also had somebody who followed me on Instagram, and then we met up for coffee. This was like probably 5 years ago, and she said, "You seem so serious online, and you're really bubbly in person." And I was like, I don't think I'd ever been called bubbly before, but like, I mean, pitch enthusiasm is my general handle, so like, I do have an enthusiasticness to me, but it was interesting to think that. So I was like, I guess if I come across as like serious or stodgy in any way, it's like, oh no, I am a very silly person.
Yeah. Awesome. I love that. Well, thank you so much for putting your trust in me to interview you and for being my first guest.
Yeah.
I love your work. I'm so excited to see what you keep doing and
Yay.
support you any way I can.
Amazing.
Where can people find you? What's your Instagram and everything?
Yeah. My art Instagram is at divine.space.doves. You can find most of my recent work there. That's probably the best place to find me. I am working on a website, but that's to be determined.
Aren't we all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, AK.
Yeah.
And I look forward to seeing your work in the future.
Amazing. Thank you for this. This was really fun.
Yeah. Yay.